Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Today we're joined by Jackman, a longtime Democratic Party activist, a great friend, and someone who's made the Santa Clara County Party as successful as it is. Jay, thanks for being on Democratic Television.
You're welcome.
So, I just said a lot of stuff about you, but before we get into that, Jay, tell me a little bit about, who you are, where'd you grow up, what were your favorite or worst subjects in school, especially in the fourth grade, whatever you want to share.
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York.
Oh.
And I was a terror in school. I was the third grade's ambassador to the principal's office. I was in trouble, and fortunately for me, I had a male. The only male teacher I had in elementary school was a sixth grade teacher, who recognized that I was just bored, and just piled on the work, and that kept me out of trouble.
No kidding.
And so I survived that and made the transition to junior high school, where there was more work, and that all worked out. Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I attended Erasmus Hall High School, one of the great public high schools in the city. Then I was an undergraduate at Columbia University in New York. I went to Harvard Medical School in Boston. I then did my internship, a rotating internship in San Francisco at the County General Hospital. I did a year's worth of psychiatric training in England after that. Then I came back and did my psychiatric residency at Stanford from 66 to 69. Then I went up to San Francisco and was the director of a drug treatment program of a community mental health center for 5 years.
In San Francisco?
In San Francisco.
Which one?
It was the West Side Community Mental Health Center, which included the Haight-Ashbury. David Smith's clinic was separate, but we served some of the same folks, and I did that. That was a remarkable period of time. It's when drugs were happening in San Francisco.
I bet. Well, let me stop you there and go back and hear a little bit more about growing up in Brooklyn. I always like to ask people, did you have any remarkable influences? Did you have the principal that was reverse motivational?
When I was growing up, when I look back at it, for my adult functioning, my dad was an enormously important influence. I don't think I would have said that at the time, but when I look back at the trajectory that my life has taken, my dad was a ward-level Democratic politician.
Oh, the machine.
Right. It was part of the New York City Democratic machine. And I was leafleting, door knob dropping from as far back as I can remember. Abraham Beam, who was the first Jewish mayor of New York City, lived on our street, was my dad's best friend, and was in our house every week. I just took that for granted, but I know that became, that just seeped into my being as something that was something that you did as part of your life, was political work. Even though I didn't understand what that actually meant. I would go out with my dad and visit every single house in his precinct. He was a precinct worker. He was what we would now call a precinct captain.
No kidding.
And this was back in the 40s. And my mom was a registrar at the polling place. So she wasn't nearly as active as he was, but it was something that was seen as normal, as normative behavior. The other thing that was very important when I look back at it was my dad's Jewish vision of the world. And what was important about that was the sense that to be a righteous, moral Jew meant to be socially, politically active. That fairness, justice, treating people well was an essential requirement for someone who professed to be an observant Jew. And again, that was not something I thought much about at the time, but it was what my dad did.
Right.
And so that became part of my world, because my value system came out in large part from my Jewish upbringing. And part and parcel of that was the notion of being politically active and doing good in the community, helping people who weren't as well off, righting the wrongs of the society, which was, in a way very different from the individualist focus
Right.
that we have. It was a communal focus, that the well-being of the community really mattered a lot.
Well, that's a lot of responsibility on a young man to have that seeped into your system. Did that influence your desire to go into the medical profession, both to become a doctor and then a psychiatrist?
Well, my dad was an attorney, and he never encouraged me to do the law. I had an aunt and an uncle who were physicians, and when I was 5 years old, I had rheumatic fever and I was in bed for 3 months. I think those had profound effects on me in terms of choosing a vocational lifetime career. In the Jewish community, you couldn't be anything higher than a doctor. That was
Epitome.
That was right. I mean, that was it. If you did that, you had achieved. I think that and I think I was subject to the prevailing values in my community at the time, and I, adapted to my peers' values. And in the high school that I went to and at Columbia, being pre-med was its own course, and I did all of that stuff.
But you went beyond being a doctor. Maybe that's not the right way to say it, but you became a psychiatrist.
Well, I became a psychiatrist because I was always interested in what made people tick. Why did people do the things that they did? And that was the only area of medicine that really addressed that. Really looked at how is it that people came to be the way they were. I mean, the theories that we had, I think when I look back at them now, I just laugh at them as being outdated and sexist and not based on any kind of actuality, but based purely on theory. But they were concerned with, how did people come to be the way they are, which was of great interest to me. And being a healer, being able to help people out of their troubles became very important to me, became something that I really wanted to be good at. So I worked at that.
So you became a psychiatrist. I mean, not to fast forward too much, because I'm sure there was a lot of years getting you there, residencies and experiences in local communities. Did you get out into the community much in your early years?
Well, I got out into the community in the sense that after I finished my residency and I worked in San Francisco and I was running a drug treatment program, that meant being out in the community.
Very much so.
Because that's where these folks were.
Right.
And so I did a lot of community work, employed people from the community in the clinics to do the work that the clinics needed doing, to be a resource in the clinics, to fight for funding. We were very successful at getting funding to develop programs, and I felt very successful at what we were. Our goals were modest because we didn't know a whole heck of a lot about effective treatments at that time. So it was, how do you mitigate the disasters that came if you didn't treat somebody? And I did that for 5 years, and then I moved to Hawaii.
Oh, that sounds like a nice change of pace.
That was wonderful. I lived by the beach. That was great. I did that for 16 years.
Oh.
And Hawaii is a state of minorities. There are Hawaiians, there are Japanese, there are Chinese, there are Filipinos, there are Portuguese, there are Puerto Ricans, there are Koreans. There are a huge number of different groups, all of which manifested psychological problems in their own distinct idiosyncratic ways, which meant that I had to learn about each community. If I was going to be helpful, I had to be educated, because what was clear was what I'd learned in my residency about how psychiatric illness and problem looks didn't apply to other cultures.
Mm.
It applied to a white middle class culture. It did not apply to Japanese farmer families or Portuguese plantation workers. And I had to learn.
So here you are in Hawaii, open for business. Did you get any business?
It became, yes, I did get business. What happened was I got some training at the East-West Center in being able to understand and to ferret out what was going on in different cultures. And the word got around that I was somebody who was particularly sensitive and interested in these issues. And Hawaii, there were enough people with problems that I developed a fairly large practice. Probably about half of the people that I saw were not Caucasian, either individually or in couples. And that was an enormous learning experience.
Who funded you to do that? Was it medical insurance, self-pay? Were they federal or state programs?
For the first year, I ran a community mental health clinic, which was funded by the state. After that, I worked part-time for the Salvation Army Addiction Treatment Facility because I was still one of the people who was really comfortable working with addicts and alcoholics, which was not common in those days. Most docs didn't want to have anything to do with people who had an addiction problem or an alcohol problem because they were messy. They weren't easy to work with. They didn't follow through on treatment plans. And
they were deceptive.
They lied. They tried to cover up what was going on. And a lot of doctors felt it wasn't worth their time. I just knew that was part and parcel of the illness. So I got preferentially, people would refer me patients with these problems, which was a win-win. They got rid of the people they didn't want to see. And they sent them to somebody like me who was reasonably good at working with these folks.
Could really delve in and, call it like it was, and I bet people
Correct.
appreciated that.
The same thing happened with post-traumatic stress disorder. There were a lot of Hawaiian kids who went into the service and came back with PTSD. The VA was scared to death of them because they saw them as kids who were ready to explode. And they didn't want to have much to do with that. So they contracted with me to see these folks because I was not afraid of them. And that worked out very well, but it also developed some expertise in post-traumatic stress disorder, which I wouldn't have ordinarily gotten.
Interesting. We're going to take a little break, Jay. When we come back, lots more to talk about. So thanks for being here.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Senator Ellen Corbett. I'm proud to be a Democrat. I've been a Democrat all my life. The reason that I'm proud to be a Democrat is I believe the Democratic Party is the party that cares about the environment, who cares about the future for our children, who will fight to make sure we have the best education for our children, and who fights for civil rights and is the party that is the party of inclusion. If you'd like to get more involved with the Democratic Party, please call us at 408-445-9500.
Welcome back to Democratic Television, and our guest, actually it's Dr. Jay Jackman, but I know you as Jay. So we had just finished up talking about you in Hawaii, leading the life of Riley, I guess. How did you get back to the mainland, if I can use that term?
Well, during my time in Hawaii, my marriage failed. And my kids were growing up and they were ready to go to college, and had started going to college in the late 80s. I was ready to leave Hawaii. And I reconnected with my current wife, who is wonderful, who I adore. And I was an usher in her first wedding. Her husband and I were fraternity brothers in college. We went to medical school together. Our families maintained connection over all the years since college. And I was visiting in the Bay Area and ended up calling her and came back to see her the following month.
From Hawaii?
Yes.
Okay.
To make a long story short, one visit and I knew she was the one for me. And so I stayed in Hawaii for another year, finishing my practice, packing things up, and then came to back to California. She's a professor at Stanford, and so I have the good fortune of living on the campus, which is heaven. And that was 1990, and Stanford was having its centennial anniversary. And I was peripherally involved as hosting one of the people on an education panel, a fellow named Yori Wada, who was a community organizer in San Francisco, who I had worked with back in the 60s and early 70s when I was with the Community Mental Health Center. And lo and behold, who should be on this panel? Bill Clinton.
Wow.
And I remember saying to my wife that, if I was younger, and this guy was running for president, I'd be working for him. Well, that came to pass, that he became our candidate. And so I became involved in local Democratic politics as a
in the
worker,
early 90s.
In the early 90s, as a just an active Democrat, nothing particular. The critical event that happened was in August of 1993. I was washing the dishes one morning and I was looking at the San Jose Mercury, and there was an article that's saying that the Foothill De Anza Community College District had 2 vacancies for trustee, and since they hadn't filled the application, the number of people they needed, they were extending the deadline for filing for another week.
Oh.
And I looked up and I said, it's put up or shut up time. That this was the opportunity. I had always been politically interested, but had never really gotten involved. I could do this. So I went down and I got myself registered. And who was there registering at exactly the same time? Paul Fong.
No kidding.
The guy right behind you who's the assemblyman now in the 22nd AD. And we both got elected to the community college board. I think that was the most meaningful, useful thing that I have done in terms of community work in my entire life. And I did that from 1993 to 1998. We left for the East Coast for a couple of years, and I had to stop doing that. But to really see how immigrant kids from working families made their way in the world, and how critically important a place like Foothill and De Anza were to their educations. So different from what went on at Stanford, which was a whole different universe. My wife and I would compare notes on what was important about each of these institutions. But that's really what got me really politically involved. Running for office meant I had to get endorsements from anybody and everybody, which meant I had to introduce myself to Anna Eshoo, to Bill Lockyer, to Al Ahlquist, John Vasconcellos.
Right, all the establishment.
All the established players. And so I became known. And so I was welcomed into the political community because I'd gotten endorsements and I was a good Democrat. And I think that doing that was the most wonderful thing, really getting to become part of the Democratic community.
Well, let me ask you some more stuff, because I know a little bit more about you than you're sharing, I think. I know that you were an advisor at Stanford to Democratic clubs. You were a mentor. You seem to be the name that I heard for many, many years as the go-to professor.
Yes, although I'm not a professor at Stanford, what happened was, because I lived on the campus, I volunteered to be the liaison from the local Democratic community to the Stanford Democrats, which was an ongoing organization. And that went back to the Clinton administration. And the first person that I worked with there was Andrew Burns, who I've maintained a wonderful, loving relationship with for, what now, 20 years?
Yeah, wonderful guy, former chair of the San Mateo Democratic Party.
Right?
Yeah.
And I worked successfully with Bill Shin, who was chair, with Kai Stinchcomb. I would be their resource. And I think that mentoring really made a difference for a lot of them. I haven't done that so much this year, but it is something that I love doing because it would keep me connected to a youth community that I would
Right.
otherwise not have much contact with.
Well, you were involved in other things too. You were involved in the California Democratic Council, the premier organization to develop grassroots club level organizations. What was the value that you saw in the CDC?
Well, partly that goes back to my childhood when my father was a member of the Madison Club, which was the powerful Democratic club in Brooklyn. And so the idea of clubs being the place where democratic things happened was normative for me. And so the CDC was attractive because it really fostered club work for Democrats. And that's where interested Democrats could become involved. It was the easiest way that they could become involved. Very few people are willing to run for office or to get named as a person to be a legislative assistant for somebody. But being in a club meant that you could connect with other Democrats and you could start being involved in activities, whether it would be registering voters, walking precincts, phone banking. There are a large number of activities that you could become involved with other Democrats who are interested in being active as well. So we in Santa Clara County had a fairly developed, sophisticated club system. We have probably something like 20 clubs in the county. But there are many parts of the state that Democrats hide because they're not welcome.
Right.
And so there's a lot of work throughout the state that needed to be done, and the CDC was the group that was doing that. So I was involved with that for a while.
Now, developing activists at a university, I think, is harder than a community where there's not quite the turnover. People are in and out over a period of years, but you know they have other things that are drawing their attention. School, a degree.
Well, the Stanford Democrats have worked out a system that works to perpetuate. They don't have to start from scratch every year. They have people in the wings waiting to advance.
So they've made their club with the understanding that there is that turnstile that people are in and out.
Sure, and they maintain participation over a period of years' time. And so they work well. And depending on the charismatic character of the leader, they can have hundreds and hundreds of members, or they can have a smaller number.
Right.
But there's a continuity that goes on that's very, very nice.
Now, you seem to spend a lot of time coming to Democratic Party meetings. I see you at our Democratic Century Club. You've usually got your hand in the air with a question or a statement. What motivates you still to want to stir it up?
Well, it's my profound belief that the society and the culture that I want to see in the United States, of fairness, of social equity, of much more equality, is only going to happen through the efforts of the Democratic Party. And I certainly put myself on the progressive side of the spectrum within the Democratic Party. And I feel it's almost an obligation that to matter in the community means to do this work. I do what works for me. Everybody would have their own particular
right
stuff. So
it sounds a little bit like a roots thing, though, your Jewish upbringing. It sounds like that's how you're living it, and you're still living it, maybe even stronger than before.
I think that that's true, and I think that that's why we have such a strong representation of Jewish participants in the Democratic organization in our county, because it is part of the culture.
Well, let me ask you this. We have about a minute and a half left. What words of advice would you give to somebody who's watching, who's thinking, it's just awful, I don't see any way to make it better, I give up?
If you feel that way, that feeling of impotence is terrible. My solution for that is to get involved, to go to the Santa Clara County Democratic Organization website on your computer, look at the calendar of events that are going on. Come to some. There may be a Democratic club that's close to you that you can visit, that you can have a chance to meet some people and perhaps get involved. There are all kinds of activities going on throughout the county. You just have to pick the one, whether it's a geographical club or an affinity club. We have an Iranian Democratic club. We have an African American Democratic club. We have a women's Democratic club. We have clubs to fit everybody. But it means coming out and saying, you know, this is important enough to me that I will put in some time exploring it, spending time, putting in time. I mean, I love the meetings. I love the meeting of the club that I'm involved with, the Dean Democratic Club, and I love our county meetings that we have every month.
And Myra is totally happy with all that.
She thinks it's terrific. She's not particularly interested in doing that herself, but she absolutely supports me in my doing of this.
That's great. Well, Jay, thank you very much for being on Democratic Television and sharing a little bit about yourself.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks for watching Democratic Television. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website, www.sccdp.org. And like Jay, help make a difference.
If I could add, if folks want to contact me, they can reach me through my email.
Which is?
jayj@stanfordalumni.org.
Great.
And I will respond.
Thank you very much.